All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome to another Awakening from the Meaning Crisis Discord Q&A. We've got a little bit of a different model here tonight. Our very own NickB is here to give us a chat about his story and what he's learned from his time in cult. So as we're sort of talking about forming and figuring out what the religion that's not a religion might look like, it's important to learn from the mistakes of others. So Nick has a lot of experience in cults, and he's
lots of mistakes.
lots of mistakes, and is generously going to tell us all about it. So yeah, thanks. Welcome, Nick.
Thank you.
So we're going to do it a little bit of a different format today. So Nick's going to start off. Has 3 sections to his presentation. So at the end of each section, if you have questions on that section, you can ask them then. If you have questions just about cults in general or the topic in general, then if you could queue them up in the event text like we normally do for these things. And again, if you want me to read out your question, please let me know that you want me to read it out. So with that, I will turn it over to Nick.
Wonderful. I will briefly add, I was asked to do this as opposed to wanting to indoctrinate everybody into my specific take on cults. So I expect some amount of disagreement here, but hopefully it is nonetheless useful. The layout that I have is initially going over my personal history and the cultic groups that I've participated in. From there, I want to do a brief kind of exploration of the etymology of the word cult and its kind of use through time and how that's changed quite dramatically, particularly in the 20th century. I then am going to pose what I've kind of my own sense making and how I've gone about kind of integrating these experiences in a little bit of an alternative framing around the concept of a cult. And then the final section is going over, what the necessary features are in the systems we normally view as cultic, and then how there's kind of good and bad versions of these things, and how things can kind of end up on a slippery slope of moving into these unhealthier forms. And that's probably where hopefully there will be the most actual use as far as like ideas of developing a written R and that kind of stuff are. Yeah. So I guess I'll launch right into it. I've been in, or rather I've interacted with 4 cults. One of which I joined consciously. It advertised itself as a cult, and that was the most recent one I had experienced. So yeah, my very first experience with dealing with kind of overtly or classically cultic systems was when I was about 19. My friend and I were quite disillusioned with the status quo life we were living of working at Starbucks and trying to have our pseudo-spirituality developing on the side. And so we made a rather radical decision to take up the woofing program. That's worldwide opportunities on organic farms. It's basically a Craigslist ad type setup of organic farms that are able to put up ads or classifieds for opportunities to work with them for any sort of trade. It could be just living and food, room and board. They could pay you, right? It's all there, and then they give a description of their specific farm. And a lot of this was in the effort of trying to learn kind of farming or permaculture skills so that we could basically create our own cult. And the specific ad we ended up choosing had advertised itself as a type of meditation center and retreat with an emphasis on organic farming. It was on the big island of Hawaii, out in an area called, or the town is called Pahoa, and the area is called Puna. It is a pretty wild place. It's the area that tourists go to see the active volcano flow out there. And the whole area is under constant threat of being wiped out by the volcano. As recent as the 80s, it took out a huge town and wiped out the highway out there. And as a side effect, no insurance companies will protect any of the land or buildings out there, and none of the utility companies will put out new lines or anything. So there's very little actual electricity. All the infrastructure was built before the 80s. And most of people's water functions off of water catchment. That area is considered the wettest area in the world. There's a specific valley in that area that gets over 600 inches of rainfall a year. Yeah, so it's an area of the U.S. that attracts people that are very much trying to live under the radar for one reason or another, whether that be their very bizarre efforts to live an alternative life, or their effort to dodge some legal issues that they had. So many false identities over there, many people with some very interesting histories, and then many people doing some very bizarre experimental cultural projects. So when we showed up, we had our backpacks, we had no car transportation, we were pretty deeply, not even very much, very little money. So we were very dependent on the scenario that we were entering to just meet our daily needs of food and lodging. And it became immediately apparent on the car ride to the property that we were going to be staying at that we were not dealing with just this kind of open-ended meditation center, but rather a very specific form of a meditation center. And that was communicated by the constant whispering we heard of a repeating mantra under the car full of people's breath that was taking us there. And they were reciting the Hare Krishna mantra. So this was a Hare Krishna cult, and the Hare Krishnas as a larger group have been identified as at least being cultic, if not overtly a cult. The specific setup that we were participating in, most would agree is like a pretty classically cultic setup. And we were on a smaller part of the farm, or a part of the community. And it started off with the indoctrination type methods pretty upfront, often rationalizing most of partaking in it on a kind of pragmatic basis of like, well, you don't have to believe everything, but start trying our practices, start repeating this mantra constantly and see what it does for you. Two other people had shown up the day before me and my friend had arrived, and under similar pretexts, and a similar mission of just kind of randomly heading out to find some people that were doing something different than the norm. And we ended up becoming very close with them. I don't want to spend too much time running through all these cults, so I'm trying to figure out which parts are the important parts to communicate here. We heard lots of stories, basically, that when new people showed up, they would put on a very nice, welcoming face, and then when people, were more committed, or new people had given up and left, they would take on a much more authoritarian stance and very harshly regiment people's lives and that were there and everything. Also on Saturdays, we were taken to a connecting farms setup, and this was kind of the actual hub of the Hare Krishnas within that area. It was a very large group. They owned tens of thousands of acres. They ran all different types of farms. There was probably upwards of 500 to 600 members of this particular branch, and then they all had kind of subdivisions where they would build around a specific person's house or whatever. But the main guy running the whole thing, his title or name, which is clearly not his real name, was Garuda. And on Saturdays, they'd have a big party where they would do the chanting and dance that is very common to the Krishna branch of Hinduism. It's basically a form of devotional dance where they would all recite the mantra. Man, I can't remember what the name of the damn word is for singing mantras. That's frustrating. And then they would invite large groups of very random people, often people they just collected off the street as they were trying to hitchhike in the area, or drug addicts or whatever, and they would offer them a free meal and then to partake in the dance. And this was one of the main mechanisms by which they gathered new people. Many of these people being too incapacitated to actually leave the area, as it's very hard to get around out there without a car. Garuda's farm had, I don't actually know the full number of people, probably between 50 and 100. It was hard to keep track of how many people there actually were working because the property was so large and the farm was so large that you couldn't quite keep track of everyone that was participating in it. But basically, he had people working 12-plus hour days, 6 days a week, working this farm that they would sell the produce at a farm stand in the area. All of them collected food stamps from the state, which in Hawaii was about $300 a month, and then they would all donate their food stamps to the group. So there was very little overhead for the people to participate there, other than having some kind of very basic level of lodging. I was sleeping under a tarp during this period. It's actually interesting. We left the people we were with because it was creeping us out after about 2 weeks, and we moved to a neighboring part that was still within the Krishna setup, but was way less hands-on. It was a noni farm. I don't know if anyone knows what noni fruit is, but it is a horrifyingly disgusting fruit that is often marketed as some type of extreme superfood and sells for a very high premium. It smells like stomach acid or bile. So there we slept in a abandoned school bus on the farm property, and we'd go and do our 4 hours of work a day, largely just collecting the bags that Lord knows how many random workers were collecting off the trees all day long. I mean, the territory that we drove to collect these bags was enormous. Often with many kind of temporary structures randomly placed throughout the farms for the workers to live in. That was also under Garuda's thing, but not his actual residence. Yeah, so this was the initial kind of interfacing with these alternative groups. It was very clear, and I was very uncomfortable. I was coming from a deeply individualist and recently coming out of a very strong atheistic phase through my teenage years, and was kind of opening my mind to spiritual practices without the metaphysics largely. So yeah, we did not get along with the people there. I often would bring up arguments and start kind of philosophical debates in the middle of their practices. And eventually that's how we ended up at the farm. The farm ended up being too much eventually, and we moved out of the farm and actually rented a cabin from the guy that owned all the monetary resources for this whole group, who also had rumors of murdering 2 people. The dramas in Pahoa were like normal dramas, but like blown out times 10 or 100. Just like little interpersonal struggles were like extraordinarily dramatic. I've told some of these stories before, but yeah. So basically, we saw what they were doing. We saw we clearly didn't fit in with the situation, and we're creating quite a bit of friction. And at the same time, it was really interesting talking to a lot of these people and getting to know them and hearing their life stories, because so many of them were people with heavy mental disorders or extreme drug addicts, or otherwise very damaged people that were able to find, honestly, what was not a bad path of life for them, that kept them sober, kept them from diving further into their psychosis, in this cultic format of largely giving over responsibility for their life and their labor and their monetary responsibilities and all these types of things. So immediately we could kind of see that while this wasn't something we wanted to do, there was certainly a distinct gray area where we could acknowledge that some bits of this were pretty creepy, and yet it also seemed to be legitimately helping a lot of these people. So yeah, we eventually moved out. One of the 2 people that had moved in before us had a car that he was borrowing from his friend that lived on the island, so we had some amount of mobility. The group of the 4 of us was 3 guys and 1 girl. When we moved out to this very remote location, by the way, it was a shack in about a mile deep into the jungle, 10 miles from the town. So you went out on the main highway out there until you hit a sign that said end of the road, and this is where in the 80s the lava flow had just wiped out the freeway. And then you walked across this lava field. Eventually you'd come to a spot where the freeway, a brief stretch of it, still existed, and then you would see a breadfruit tree, which, if people aren't familiar, is a tree that grows a very large spiky fruit, kind of like a jackfruit. And that's where you turned right into the jungle and walked for about a mile and ended up at a shack, and we lived in that shack. So it was very difficult for us. There's not much traffic going out to a highway that terminates in a lava field. So it was not particularly easy to get back into town. We were probably walking upwards of 15 miles a day on average. About 5 miles until you were deep enough in the highway that there were neighborhoods where people were driving, and so you could get a ride to and from, and then, whatever walking we were doing in the town and in the surrounding area. We were running off water catchment that was infested with mosquito larvae, which was great. We didn't realize that until about 2 weeks in. So we ate quite a number of mosquito larvae. It was infested with cockroaches as well. There's no natural predators in Hawaii, so all of the nasty critters reproduce without limit. And about a week and a half into this, me and the one girl, got together, which sent the 2 guys off on their own journey. And one of the 2 guys, my friend and the guy that she had come with, were the 2 guys. He had the car. So we were suddenly stranded out in this very remote area without a vehicle. They said they'd be back in a few days, that they were going for a hiking trip. And about a week in, we realized that they probably weren't coming back, with no word from them. We very naively held on to the hope that they would return for quite a while. So then, yeah, it was just me and her out there. And eventually we heard word of a other community that was a little closer to town and had other people there. It's also very dangerous as a white person to be hitchhiking on those roads. You hear many very, very gross stories of the locals abusing obviously non-local people there to very extreme degrees. One of the stories a few years before we'd gotten there was a girl camping at one of the national parks, and a group of methed out locals came, raped her, ran her over with their truck, broke her hip, raped her, and then threw her off a cliff. And you would regularly hear stories of them, just turning the car a little because you're walking on the edge of the highway and running people over. So you didn't want to go out at night. You wanted to have some type of community that offered you some type of security and the ability to, have extra resources while no one had refrigerators. So we moved to a place called Cinderland, which called itself an eco-village. And this was actually quite a bit of fun. It was basically a hippie commune built out of a lava field that a guy named Jesus of Cinderland, with a Z, Gezus, Jezus, had bought and restored, and it was actually very beautiful. And the month and a half that we were there, Jesus was actually on the mainland, going apparently through an identity crisis. So it was relatively mild living there, and many of the more cultic aspects were muted, and it was largely just a bunch of hippies that would have a big marijuana pizza party on Saturdays to compete with the Krishna's food party. So he had these two rival groups, each trying to indoctrinate or at least interest people in their little setup, battling over where to go on Saturday night. So yeah, they'd make pot pizza and then have a big drum circle, and kind of anyone was invited to come hang out. There's usually groups of around 80 people that show up. Eventually, we decided to come back to the mainland, and ironically, I didn't actually realize how culty Cinderland was until about a decade later, when they came up on Reza Aslan's cult project he was doing with a media organization. I forget which one. But yeah, Cinderland was one of the places he visited, and it turns out that the giant tarps that we were all sleeping under were intended to be sails on an ark that would be sailed from the Big Island to Machu Picchu to restart humanity after global warming sufficiently raised the sea levels that sailing directly to Machu Picchu in a boat was a possible thing to do. And the whole thing was built around Jesus with a Z's whole idea of this end times prophecy and his Noah-like calling to build an ark. None of that was...
Is that also the plot of Waterworld, Nick?
Yeah, I think so. I've never seen Waterworld, but I've heard many times that that's the plot of Waterworld.
We should have Cult 5 movie night.
Yeah, so that was cult experience number 2, granted at the time, and I have plenty of very fun stories from that time. Getting my first acupuncture from a guy named Thunder, who put needles all the way through my feet, in between the two major bones of my feet, as a grounding mechanism, but through the top, piercing out the bottom of my foot, which made me quite terrified of needles for a good while after. Mermaid getting attacked by 2 crackheads that were throwing piss on her because she had murdered her ex-boyfriend, which culminated in the entire group coming out to chase the crackheads off, fronted by a guy named Pueo, who had previously gotten rat lungworm disease, which is a neurodegeneration born from a parasite of slugs eating rat poop. So he's just such a classic character. He had a mustache, a ponytail. He was about 5'4" or so. In his 40s, no t-shirt, always wore board shorts with combat boots, and had 2 young children. But just the image of him with this tick, neurological tick he had from the disease, so he would, kind of twitch out every now and again while speaking, pushing his kid and his 2-year-old in the stroller over this lava field, telling off these crackheads is perhaps one of my fond memories of this experience. It was a very interesting time. I eventually came back to the mainland with the girl. We moved to a cabin. She eventually developed some mixture of schizophrenia and bipolar disorder that resulted in a very strong suicidal ideation and a very extravagant level of psychosis, and we were also quite isolated in this location. That story did not end particularly well, although it gave me a very clear idea of how deeply open we are to having our sense of reality just overcome by someone who was clearly experiencing reality, even if diluted, in a much stronger way than I was. So I could see myself getting sucked into her psychosis, even as I was trying to help her deal with it and bring her back kind of down to earth. Skipping over most of that outside of how it pertains to this discussion, we eventually broke up. Her she thought I was a form of the Antichrist, and had been infected by a parasitic alien living on my back, which eventually led to her leaving. Yeah, I've got a weird story. Just seeing some of the head nods in the
No, it's so odd because I thought that about you for like the first couple of times I met you.
Yeah, I think
And I
we need to
realized
double
you weren't the
check.
Antichrist. I was like, actually, you're pretty cool. Yeah, it's weird. Same thing.
Oh gosh. So yeah, she moved out. Eventually, her psychosis got exponentially worse without someone to kind of offer some sense of grounding there. Her parents eventually came out to the area and rescued her, if you will. She ended up getting electroshock therapy to rebalance her out, and likely heavy doses of psychotropic stabilizers that eventually led to her seemingly recovering. So that's it has at least a decent end at the end of the story there. Following that situation, I was quite extremely depressed. It had taken, in all of its forms, a tremendous toll on my sense of self and self-worth and all these kind of things. So I spent a good year in quite a very deep depression following that whole scenario. And interestingly, right as I started kind of coming out of it, I picked up some hobbies, rock climbing, and kind of made friends and started connecting myself back to life. I developed type 1 diabetes, which is an autoimmune disorder where your immune system kills the insulin-producing cells in your pancreas. And this was 2012, I believe. So that took a little bit of a blow. I recovered fairly quickly. Oh no, I'm skipping stuff. Cult 3. So this is in between breaking up with the girl and getting type 1 diabetes. Cult 3 was the same friend that I had gone to Hawaii with. We went through about a year where we weren't on great terms due to the dramas of the situation, and eventually we became friends again, and everything was good. He had a person that gave a guest lecture at his college, many years before all this stuff happened, who had heavily inspired him with kind of this new age message and a relatively robust symbolic system of love. And, I'll go more into this, but he had left a very deep impression on him. The guy had run a permaculture farm. So again, in the pursuit of trying to learn permaculture, he contacted this guy and asked if we could come out to his farm and learn some permaculture. And at this time, my friend now had a wife and a child, a 2-year-old. And so all of us went out to this guy's farm in Idaho, on the Panhandle. And it quickly became obvious upon going there that there was a lot more to the story than just permaculture. And so we later found out that this guy basically had run an apocalyptic cult that failed when his prediction for the end of the world came out to not be accurate, which I think was in 2010 is when he had situated it. And it ends up that he had used McKenna's time wave zero theory, like straight up took everything from it, including the use of the I Ching to try and map where these changes would occur. Had predicted the end of the world, had a pseudoscientific theory about how the planet Nibiru, or Planet X, would fly by the Earth any year now, flipping not its electromagnetic axis, but its actual physical axis about 90 degrees, which would cause the atmosphere to light on fire, creating an enormous fireball around the planet that would scorch the Earth to 6 feet below surface level, while causing enormous hurricanes and tsunamis and everything else. He had based all this off of the I Ching and had plotted out the dates by looking at past historical events, much in the way that McKenna did. He just had a different mechanism and view of what the event was going to be. So by the time we showed up, it was just him and his wife. They'd lost all of their cult following upon the failure of this prediction. But he was nonetheless trying to convince us of his model. And again, it was very interesting because you had this philosophy promoting love and community and care, all built on top of the impending end of the world. And this is very common in cultic structures. It's very common in non-cultic structures, or I'll get more refined with this, but I'm using cultic structures here in a way that most people would agree that's a cult and this thing over here isn't. But apocalyptic mythos is tremendously common in all worldviews, whether they are religious or not. And I do have a theory for why that is. It's not very complicated, right? It's the externalization of our own death projected upon the world so that we can interface with it and come to terms with it. And likewise, forming some idea of hope from within these modes of deep transformation. Anyways, I was battling this guy constantly. I had a much stronger grasp of at least some amount of current scientific theory to be able to push back against him quite strongly. And I should point out, interfacing with these three cults, again, coming deeply from my kind of individualist mythos, I viewed myself as like a pressure tester. I could see clearly, and so I could fight and argue these scenarios better than most could. And that kind of grew as I interacted with one after another. And I had started to learn, particularly in these kind of new agey groups where people have a tendency to heavily idealize the positive side of the spectrum and to try and disown their negative emotions or shadow. to ruin a cult leader in these scenarios is very easy. All you have to do is get them to reveal their shadow in some extravagant way, and it usually takes very little actual pushing to get them to do so. And then you can just point out the hypocrisy between their message and their behavior. So yeah, new age cults are very easy to take down if you are interested in doing so. We got kicked out from there about a month and a half after trying to make it work, and my constant arguing, some of the arguments getting pretty heated. And yeah, we left. And I moved to Santa Cruz, which is where I still am after the Idaho later in that year, after getting diabetes. Got diabetes, moved here to Santa Cruz about 3 months after I was diagnosed, and have been here since. Went through, I started playing around quite heavily. There's a lot of really interesting groups I hung out with when I first moved here. The whole music industry groups in the area, some of the more new agey groups, and all kinds of stuff. I had a lot of fun. It was a method of social relating that I had not well developed before then. I eventually got a job at a major jewelry producer within the festival community called Third Eye Pine Cones, who have a bit of a cult following within the festival community. And I ended up working with them for about 3 years until I finally went to a festival, and my illusions had dropped about what was happening within these festival and new age communities, and just how rampant they were with absolute bullshit, and how artificial the supposed growth and transformation was. And this actually created in me a pretty strongly manic state as my worldview that I had been using for quite a number of years, kind of in the Petersonian sense, the dead wood all burnt very rapidly and all at once. And I go into more detail. I've done 5 interviews with Paul Vanderklay on his channel, where I run through a lot of this in a lot more detail. And I've shared this specific part earlier in one of our discussions, sharing religious experience. But basically, I was in this relatively manic phase. I had the distinct sensation of being able to see into people or through people. Not quite psychic, but almost more like I was not blinding myself intentionally to any of the signals people were putting out. And they were putting out so many signals that it was really easy to see the artifice of their identity. Also, the symbolic impact of the world and the modern world became very transparent. There was almost this constant revelation of a death wish, of a hope for apocalypse, seemingly screaming from everything, from the way we structured our cities, to the architecture, to the mode people behaved when interacting with these systems. All of which I almost describe as a type of extreme flow state that I could not leave. I could not get out of it. I could not come back to norm. And ironically, this was in many ways what I had been dreaming was my ideal state while partaking in these kind of new age communities. Finally I could see. And upon finally seeing, all I could wish for was that I wish I could stop seeing so much. Like, please, I don't want to see what I'm, the nature of the situation. Let me be back in the kind of dream of what this is. Eventually, I realized that if I laid myself out on the floor in a classically prayer or submission-like position, that I found some relief. And again, I would describe this in very physical terms of like feeling energy moving through the body, or like which areas of my nervous system were being lit up. in that position, it felt like the energy could actually flow all the way through the spine and could leave the body instead of kind of regurgitating inside of the body, leading to this schizophrenic-like state where my delusions were being filled with so much of this kind of psychic energy that they started to manifest themselves in my phenomenology. I spent a number of days spending a lot of time in that position, again, just because it was the only thing I could find relief in. And eventually this led to a very powerful religious experience of some type of being interfacing with me, touching me on the forehead, which led to this enormous sensation of like clearing out, where these kind of like blockages in the energy in the body were suddenly opened and the energy could just fall through without me like getting into these manic states as a side effect. And then it told me to get up, get off my knees, like quit whatever you're doing right there. That's not, and I was deeply relieved from this state. And most bizarrely, my type 1 diabetes went away temporarily. And as measured, I was doing finger prick tests. It wasn't like magic or something, or I just thought it was gone. It was physically not responding. I stopped taking insulin for about a month. After about a month, it destabilized. And I had noticed this destabilization phenomenologically as well, as I was trying to interface with the world and go to do my job and all these things in these rather extravagant states of mind. Another 2 weeks, I think it was a total of a month and a half, I was off insulin. And then, a month afterwards, it had started to destabilize. 2 weeks later, I took insulin again because my blood sugars were totally off the map once again. And in that state, I had basically created an ultimatum at my job where either I could play a role in the upper management of the company or I needed to leave. And during that time, actually right after coming back from the festival, I got a random friend request on Facebook from the person that ended up being the cult leader of cult number 4. So going through this state, I was interacting with him, but mostly in a sense of battling. I was trying to take him down in the way that I dealt with previous cult leaders. And, it was fun and all this stuff. And I found that even at the highest state I had experienced, I could not take this person down. So the perfect confluence of events all lined up. And I basically, upon... It's a bizarre story in itself, how almost successful I was in taking over a company that I just decided I should run for no reason at all. Like they were really bizarrely considering actually letting me run this company. Eventually, I kind of blew my fucking, I lost my patience to deal with the situation, and they were able to see that break and go, oh, okay, we need to, push this person out. Properly so. So I left that company, and in this kind of bizarre state of coming down from this very ecstatic state, and finding myself in a very, separated from a lot of the systems that I was partaking in to contextualize my life leading up to that moment. Holy shit, I've almost gone for an hour. Good Lord, I need to speed it up. Man, that's intense. Wow. I basically viewed it as this sign that I clearly had something to learn from this person. I did not naively go that they're some magical person or anything like that, but rather viewed it in this kind of deeply pragmatic sense of like, okay, they've learned something I haven't, and whatever they learned is deeply related to emotional processing that I'm very unskilled at, and emotional stability. So I ended up eventually, after a number of months, joining that cult. And this is where the story is a lot harder for me to tell, because there's so many aspects, and because all of it was taking place online, there's not a clear lived-in narrative that I can relate. And for the sake of brevity, and I probably should, this is the area I should least have applied brevity, but basically this cult started as a transformational type setup. And as the kind of inability of it to deliver on what it had said it could deliver on became more apparent, it started sliding into more authoritarian takes. Until, right, so it's like, okay, we're not getting to the ends, so it must mean our means is not as important as we thought. And there's this slide from the means being primary to the ends being primary, and sacrificing the means in the process. And eventually it went from its cult formation as a pseudo-temple, pseudo-religious structure, to a pseudo-militaristic structure, and started calling itself using military terminology. And it was about two or 3 weeks, maybe a month after it made that change, that I went, okay, this is something clearly has gone wrong. I could pull away from it enough to see the trend, and I left. The people that did not leave, it took a while, but after this was also its transition from URL to IRL. So moving from online only to like they're bringing people all into the same area under the same roof, and are getting a lot more hands-on with its techniques. And so I never ended up meeting the leaders in person, although I had met a couple of the other members. And that whole thing I could really spend a lot of time talking about, and the details of how incredibly powerful its manipulations were, and how counter to many of the concepts people have of cults is. But I'm hoping it will kind of come through in the later sections, and I've already spent way too much time here, so you can also go look at the Paul Vanderklay videos where I talk a little bit more about this if you're interested. But I will try and end it there for now and see if anyone has any questions.
Does anyone else have a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
I do, but I have missed a lot of what you said, Nick. So just from the last, half an hour or so, I have so many questions. The first thing I want to say is I feel like I should have paid for that. Even just like the last bit that I heard, would have paid for it. It was, incredible to listen to. You're unusually insightful about what seemed to be the most like discombobulating experiences, right? Like a lot of people just have no insight. Like, it's a very strange time in my life, but you're like, it was structured this way. I was drawn because I was, and so, yeah. Anyway, I would have paid. The question is, you think that as a personality, there's something called the authoritarian personality. It's a kind of old, kind of somewhat hackneyed psychological construct, and a lot of people take it to mean like like Hitler, authoritarian personality.
Right.
It's more the people who are drawn, people who seem to exude some kind of authority. Interestingly, and I don't know if this is true in every case, but it seems to be that you were drawn by a kind of a challenge.
Yes.
Like, I'm going to debunk this because and then somehow you're like turned around.
Yeah.
So why is it that you think you're drawn to something in that sense, not as a true believer from day one, right? But you go in to challenge things, and then somehow you're like, wait, what just happened there? So what is it that you make of that facet of your personality?
So it is interesting too, because I never dropped the challenge in Cult 4. Literally, it made use of people's doubt as part of its structure. It was constantly infighting. So I never actually let go of the idea that I'm like either here to believe in this and follow it, or I'm here to destroy it because it's fucked. And so again, like I went into it with like a really deeply pragmatic kind of framework. And a lot of it was, it's almost like a cheesy old kung fu movie, you know, like, you know, I brought my best kung fu against this master, and he easily defeated me even at my peak. So then I, go, okay, well, I'll learn your kung fu then. It's
you have beaten me, master. I will join your
right.
school. No
Right.
one has ever bested me and traveled the lands. Was it because you're scientifically inclined in some sense, right? So it wasn't like you were trying to argue, a particular kind of crystal against a particular kind of, like a rune sign. You're trying to falsify and find contradictions and collapse a worldview.
Right.
So what was it? Rational arguments that this guy had,
sorry, just before you answer, we just hit 25 people. Maybe let's turn off our cameras.
Cool.
Because otherwise people are going to get blocked. Sorry, go
on. It was not rationally based, and it made very obvious use of not rationality, but a very different style of argumentation. It was very deeply involved in trolling, and basically the efficacy of trolling and how deep of an effect it can have on someone's perception of themselves and their worldview. And in many ways, it could attack the overuse of rationality itself. Granted, it did so in a very particular way. So there's aspects here of kind of classic, Lifton's thought-stopping techniques. And yet, the thought-stopping techniques were not thought-stopping in and of themselves. Rather, they very deeply focused one on their phenomenological experience and asked the person, if you're going to make the argument, know where you're making it from and what tools you're using and why you're using them. So there was a lot of like shadow integration type stuff in Cult 4. And that was part of what made me go, I clearly have something to learn here. As belonging in all these kind of new agey circles for so long, I had kind of subconsciously picked up the lack of integration of the shadow. And then I had the weakness in my ability to wield the shadow very blatantly called to my attention just by interacting with this person or these people. I don't know if that answered your question or not. But
no, it does.
Okay.
Basically, the rational way of calling you to question your rational underpinnings. Which disarmed your rationality by removing their foundation effectively.
Yes.
Which is a kind of jujitsu move. Nothing against jujitsu, but thanks. Good answer.
Right.
Thank you.
And a lot of it was like, it was a legitimate question of like, why am I placing so much faith in my intellect when I am also overtly aware of its ability to bullshit itself? And what I saw in them was a type of like deep ontological security that I was lacking and was trying to make up for by over-intellectualizing everything. That's how I interpreted it at the time, at least.
Can I ask a gratuitous bonus question? If
Please.
It's okay. You think that they traded? Sorry.
Yeah, no, let's keep it quick, just because he has a lot more to go through, and there's a few other questions I think for this section. But
then I'll pass. But thanks so much, Nick. That was awesome.
Great.
Tell me, I think you had a question on this section.
Yeah, can you hear me? Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, I was getting some lag, and I actually missed the detail that I was really curious to know. I heard you say that you got a job at a festival jewelry company, and then I lost you, and then I heard that you were in that crazy manic state, and I missed how you got there. If you could maybe just recap that.
Yeah. Yana, I'm going to temporarily mute. Oh, there we go. Yeah, so I was, we were working out of a garage at a house, pumping out these pendants. And us, the actual craftsmen behind it, had very little interfacing with the festival circuit side of it. And so I was kind of operating under this bizarre mythology of what I thought I was doing and what I thought was going on in the festival circuits, particularly the more spiritually oriented ones, which were the ones that we were largely dealing with. And it was upon being invited after about 2.5, almost 3 years of working for the company to go see the festival end of it, that my kind of mythos with which I was using to contextualize my life came crumbling down quite rapidly, and that seemed to spark the burning of dead wood moment, or the burning very hot, as I've called it before.
That's quite interesting. Thank you.
Right. Anybody else?
Just on this section. We'll ask general questions at the end.
Oh, thank you, Jada Vids. Kirtan is indeed the word I could not think of for the Hare Krishnas singing. Where's the ramping up of victim culture and a particular expression of white fragility? I'll save your question there, Jada Vids, for the end, as it's a little off topic for this section. And DMT, how are cults economically viable? There's endless ways in which they can form economically viable strategies. Cult 4 was deeply not economically viable, but the Krishnas had definitely figured that whole thing out. But yeah, there's a quite a many number of ways one might go about doing so. Okay. So, to try and get through this, we're already halfway through, which is not a good sign for being able to make it through a lot of the material that I had planned. It may be that we could split this up if it seems.
Yeah, we can always do a part 2.
Right. So yeah, that actually might be useful, almost viewing this whole section as problem formulation, and then maybe doing a briefer part 2 where we go over some of the potential answers to those problems.
Yeah, I think people are finding the story pretty fascinating. So especially on the latest quote where you said it's probably useful to go into more detail. That might be great.
Right. Yeah, I could. Yeah, okay, that makes sense. We could do that, and then dive into some of the framing stuff. So yeah, Cult 4 was really interesting in that by any normal definition of, or not normal, by almost any normal, oh my gosh, I did it again. Any scholarly definition of cult that is usually touted by supposed cult experts, it was technically not a cult. However, it called itself a cult and very obviously had many features that would make one say this is a cult, even if in the details it avoided the scholarly definition of what a cult was. Yes, Kat, I know. Get out of here. So
I want to hear what the cat thinks.
She's very opinionated, very often. Do you want to go outside? There we go. So for one, the leaders of the cult were not taken as some type of like super authority. Combating them, questioning them was entirely welcome. And it very much, again, took on that kind of like kung fu vibe. And eventually, after losing to the same person so many times, you just kind of accept that you're going to lose the next time as well. But it invited, this frame of not agreeing for the sake of agreeing or creating this intense mythos around the leaders. Granted, that did become more present later in the cult's development. We might be able to tie some of this in. Well, I'll keep giving a description and we can try and play with it a little within the description. If you look into Lifton's 8 tenets of thought reform, for people that aren't familiar with Lifton, he kind of wrote the book, he literally wrote the book on brainwashing that came out of him analyzing the Maoist Chinese indoctrination methods. The first one in his list is milieu control, or controlling the information that one has access to. One may be very familiar with that in the idea of these thought bubbles that form from having AIs guide what we think we will, or what we will click on. And so there's a very deep level of milieu control just operating in our lives now as a matter of course from organizing and making use of the internet. There was none of that in this cult. It directly interfaced with culture, with pop culture. There was no containment on, what you could interact with or anything like that, or what the trusted sources of information were. In some sense, all sources of information, including those in the cult, were to be considered suspect. Granted, it did have a way of organizing what ended up being really powerful techniques for communicating a worldview just by juxtaposing content siphoned off of the internet from any number of sources. So by basically in the same way that people would make a Tumblr board where you could hone in on a sense of their aesthetic just by them collecting media in a particular way. They made extravagant use of that to try and communicate ideas, much more so than actually communicating the ideas. And I might add that many cults nowadays are moving, I think, in some sense, away from the idea of milieu control and into the idea of milieu flooding, which is to say that if you flood the information sources that a person has access to, they will perform the milieu control of their own accord by projecting their worldview onto the information just so that they can navigate the world. And this is a really subtle change that I think has really profound effects in how people go about sense making in our current time. Let's see. We can perhaps. I think what I'm going to try and do here is pull in Lifton overtly and kind of go through his list of thought reform and mind control bits, and then kind of relate them to Cult 4 and try and show how they're both similar and different, and how new forms of cultic structures might be effective in an age where it's a lot harder to recognize them as such. So using that as a primer, the next one that Lifton brings up is mystical manipulation. And this is the overt manipulation of experiences to make them appear spontaneous when they are in fact controlled and intended. So this is like magic, right? The magician has a very specific way of focusing your attention on certain things so that you can't see the trick and then surprising you with the trick at the end. And I would say that this is ever less present. Well, it's tricky because it's still extraordinarily present in pseudo-religious or religious or transformative communities, even political. But it's this is a lot of like the conspiracy theory. You can attach patterns to things and then suddenly make them appear mystical regardless of whether someone was intending to give you the impression that it was mystical or not. And I would say another big side effect of this is the huge uptick in psychedelics, which opens up the pattern finding systems in the brain so wide that you basically don't even need to trick the person. You just have to get them to trick themselves. Or even, very slightly give the indication that they should be on psychotropic substances as some form of enlightenment or something along those lines. That's not to say that they cannot have a positive effect, but it is to say that they can very, very easily be manipulated. There was, in Cult 4, there was a lot less of that, but there was a very, in the overt sense, but there was very much the conspiratorial, very wide net cast for pattern recognition. Granted, it was also part of the cult to not be on any substances. So, you get kind of a interesting juxtaposition there. Demand for purity. In many ways, Cult 4 was anti-purity and purity very deeply at the same time. So one of the things they asked was that everyone wear white. Granted, I never ended up actually doing this. But one of the members did, and the leaders did, except that the wearing of white was not actually meant to represent your purity so much as to be honest, such that you could not hide the dirt and the stains and all these, bits you collect walking around in the world on white clothing. They reveal everything. And so that was actually the ideal behind the white clothing. Rather than trying to create an image of purity, it was trying to be honest with the lack of purity. And at the same time, it was meant to operate then as, well, if you can stay clean in white clothing, it means that you're paying very deep attention to how you are interacting with the world. Because it requires a tremendous amount of mental labor to keep from dirtying your white clothes. It did have a demand for purity in the sense of honesty. However, that deep demand for honesty carried with it a deeply anti-purist connotation. And it was very deeply focused on integration of the shadow and not trying to pretend you are something you are not. So there's a lot of bizarre inversions happening there, where you can still end up with something like a demand for purity that is not on its surface or even in practice the kind of familiar forms of purity testing that we normally come across. Right, there was no deeply moral purity testing or anything like that. Although it did have very strict regulations on how one should live their life. And one of the main tenets was to be extraordinarily pure in your physical life so as to open up more flexibility in your emotional life. And, one of their tenets was that they believed that basically we had this inverted, that people were trying far too hard to create an image of emotional purity and sacrificing physical purity on its altar. So, right, you see the false, Instagram star or YouTube star, and they always make sure the room behind them is impeccable and organized, and they've got all their makeup on, and the lighting is just right. Meanwhile, the camera falls down one day, and you see behind, their veil, and it's just this shithole, rat nest of a place they're living in, or like however that may be occurring. So they were trying to take that image focus and flip it on its head. And I think there is actually, there is, as much as I would like to say everything about the cult was bullshit and they were evil, there were many aspects where it's like, well, that's actually not entirely off base. We probably should be paying more attention to the purity of our environments. Ironically, this was well before Jordan Peterson hit the market, and his main message, of course, main meme being the clean your room meme, and how that offers one a certain level of emotional stability. Confession is the next on Lifton's list, and this is normally a way to gain power over a person by blackmailing. It can also be a way to guilt trip them into feeling like they need whatever it is you're selling in a type of racketeering manner. I would add to this that the idea of confession, while still very prevalent, obviously, like this is the whole hyper leftist thing, of course, along with the moral purity testing. But I would also say that we, in many ways, have replaced the idea of confession with the idea of authenticity. Which is to say, one should unapologetically be a confessionalist. Which is arguably what the original purpose of confession was. But so yeah, one more bit to pay attention to, and how these ideas kind of have morphed since the time of Lifton's writing. And you got two ends there: the guilt complex of confession, and then the honest, positive aspect of confession, which I think there is much value to, but it is also dangerous. Sacred science, the group's doctrine or ideology, is considered to be the ultimate truth beyond all questioning or dispute. Again, the cult specifically, it did not have this orientation towards ideology in the normal sense. It very much had its quite rigid practices and ways of doing so, and yet rationalized them on a deeply pragmatic basis rather than an ideological basis. And again, I think that is a transition that really needs to be paid attention to as people move forward in these types of things. And I think a lot of this comes from the switch in having a normative, objective truth as the standard, the cultural standard, to having this much more subjective concept of truth that is largely defined on one's ability to exhibit narcissistic power. Right? How to overwhelm someone's subjectivity with your own subjectivity, and how that changes the nature of what we might consider a sacred science. However, you then have projects like Vervaeke's, where there's kind of a mixture of having a sacred science and this kind of a pragmatic basis, and this attempt to deal with it by removing metaphysics. And I have support and critique in all of that motion. It is one thing to be aware of. Loading the language and thought-terminating cliches. This is perhaps one of the aspects that people are more familiar with. There's been quite a bit of discussion in Vervaeke's group about the idea of reinventioing terms, as it is a form of loading the language. And right, thought-terminating cliches are almost platitudes or meme structures that allow one to communicate an ideology without having to explain the ideology in a way that makes the person on the receiving end believe that it's self-evident. There's lots of ways to do that, and both of these are so deeply written into what it means to use language at all that I think we have to be really careful about drawing lines in this territory. Cult 4 very much had heavy manipulation of language, and one could consider this part of its anti-purity or anti-charismatic tone, in that it very heavily misspelled things to the point of creating a repulsion response within people that used language normally. Part of that was rationalized on it actually makes it safer for those that are encountering your message, because it makes you really easy to dismiss. Right? They can go, oh, this guy's clearly a fucking idiot, and they don't have to read past the external symbols to what you're actually communicating. Likewise, it has a filter bubble in that it selects for people that are willing to look past the normal credibility judgments that we are running filters on to decide what is good information from bad information, and selects for people that are willing to look beyond the immediate expression of words. Likewise, there was very many made-up terms and specialized language, specialized use of language within Cult 4. A lot of it quite useful, a lot of it, manipulative, and it kind of went all over the place in that regard. Doctrine over person. Members' personal experiences are subordinated to the sacred science, and any contrary experiences must be denied or reinterpreted to fit the ideology of the group. I would say, again, this is kind of related to sacred science in that it seems like we are switching doctrine over person to person over person. Again, because we are losing our grip on there being such a thing as objective truth. And a side effect of this is that we've entered into this battling of ontological states, or perhaps more accurately, narcissistic states. So yeah, there's a lot of ways you could go into that. Cult 4 flirted on the edge of this. It very deeply cared and did many processes to look at and record and deeply pay attention to people's subjective experience. However, it also reinterpreted those experiences within its sense-making framework. And I think that is fundamental to any type of therapy. So I think if one, again, draws the line too harshly here, you're going to throw out most systems of any type of transformational system in the process. So we might want to reframe that question later. And then the final one with Lifton is Dispensing of Existence. The group has the prerogative to decide who has the right to exist and who does not. This is usually not literal, but means that those in the outside world are not saved, unenlightened, unconscious, and they must be converted to the group's ideology. Again, in Cult 4, this was partially true and partially not true. It definitely had a bifurcation in the in-group and the out-group. It did not then suppose that the people had to be literally in the cult to be part of the in-group. And likewise, being in the cult did not save you from being in the out-group. So, there's a lot of fuzziness here, particularly when interacting with Lifton and thinking that it's giving us a really useful tool for interacting with systems as they now operate. There is a lot of value here. There's also a lot that's a little questionable, and there's a lot that has transformed so radically that paying too much attention to Lifton can actually blind you to the other ways in which one might be manipulated or have their thoughts contextualized by an external system. Ooh, that was a lot of talking. Do we have any questions on this whole bit?
So how do you think these cult leaders manipulate people into these worldviews? Like, what do you think the strategy is there? How do you think they're effective?
Oh, man. I think in my own sense making, people have a deep solipsistic vulnerability, right? It's Kant, right? It starts at Kant. This is kind of like the whole thrust of postmodernism, but it's there in Nietzsche. It's really become part of our context, is kind of realizing how vulnerable we are as in this very solipsistic manner, right? One can always cast doubt on one's self or perceptions, not only of themselves but of the world around them. And people have been making use of that vulnerability now for a very long time. Right, the Century of the Self documentary goes into how this was played within much more secular contexts, with the development of propaganda and advertising and public relations from Freud's nephew. So putting to use psychoanalysis to manipulate very large groups of people into herd-like behavior. So, at some level, the question is like, why does advertising work? And to me, it just seems to be like it's part and parcel of human sense making to begin with. And we can definitely dive more into that sense making and its vulnerabilities and how they're misused against us. And likewise, some amount of it is deeply owning how insanely vulnerable we are in this regard, right? And in many ways, I have at times kind of blamed the ideology of individualism for atrophying people's ability to recognize this, because we rationalize all of our behavior as coming from us, when the very, very vast majority of it is coming from our affiliations with the people in our lives, with the groups we interact with, and with the culture that we participate in. Did that answer the question?
That was very interesting. Thank you.
Mark, you had a question?
Yeah, Nick. So one of the things I hear talked about a lot, I don't know where this is coming from necessarily, I think it's more related to the game A, game B thing, is the concept of this memeplex being the force that manipulates people. And so, from that, I imagine for various reasons, I'm sure surprise no one, that the memeplex must play, or some version of a memeplex must play a role in some of these cults. And so I don't want to get ahead of your stories or the pieces that you're laying out here. So I'll just couch this in the context of, so far for cults 1 through 4, have you seen elements that you would describe as a memeplex that interact in a way that is significant to encouraging people to adhere into the cult?
Right. It's a great question. Absolutely. I would say more fundamentally than, well, it gets a little tricky, right? Because I will later go on to try and play with the idea of cult. And in many ways, it seems like a cult is where these memeplexes interface with sociology. Right. So it's not just in the worldview as a subjective filtering. Neither is it wholly located in the outside groups and the social structures, but it seems to be this bizarre, or perhaps natural marriage of how our worldviews form themselves into sociological structures as we go about interacting with the world through our memeplexes, if you will. Cult 4 was most obviously overtly aware of the use of memes and the creation of memeplexes as kind of distortion fields by which one uses the meme to create. And it was very overtly involved with creating a very robust memeplex. Now, these memeplexes were, of course, obviously present in all the other cults as well, yet there was some sense of naivety or a lack of awareness about that aspect, in that they still believed in a kind of modernist notion that they had some access to a legitimate truth. That justified the memeplex and took it out of the meta understanding of what a belief system is doing or a worldview is doing. Man, I feel like I'm rambling so much. I hope this is coherent, guys.
I love it.
No, it sounds good. It sounds good, Nick. I had a quick follow up. I'm just because I always do this, right? I'm just trying to wonder if if you think that my formulation that the memeplex is the mediating force for a type of participatory manipulation would be a correct formulation for the cults you've experienced.
Yes, it would. And I would also add that type of manipulation is entirely unavoidable. And so I would focus the question around not how do we get out of memeplexes, but how do we judge which ones are healthy and have constructive effects from those, proper mediation from those that are creating negative or disastrous effects.
Yeah, I think that's where I was yesterday. So I'm just going to stick my tongue out metaphorically. It's semi-rational, and maybe factually too, if he's still here. Yeah, thank you.
Did you have any negative repercussions for leaving any of these 4 cults?
No.
Mhm.
Not by the cults themselves. But yes, on the other end, just because, at least particularly in Cult 4, which I actually looked at the dates recently, I was interacting with Cult 4 for about a year and a half, and I was in the cult for a little over a year. But just as a side effect of interacting with it, you accrue, your community, your sense of meaning in life, like all these things get sucked up into belonging in the cult. So even if the cult had no repercussions whatsoever for saying no, and matter of fact, the cult constantly was asking for consent.
Did you
Which could be-
experience depression after leaving the last one?
Yes. Yeah, definitely.
So you experienced it after every cult?
Mostly after 4, the Cult 4.
Okay.
I had some amounts of it in the other ones, but they were mostly easy enough to dismiss, and I was confident enough in my deconstruction of their systems that it didn't have as strong of a negative effect. Also, I did not build nearly as deep of relationships within those other 3.
You talked about being delusional at some point. Did the first 2 cults, I think it was between the second and third maybe, did they get you to that? Did they induce that state somehow in you?
No, but staying in a 1-room cabin with a schizophrenic bipolar person definitely did.
Wow.
Oh, semi-rational. You're mute. You gotta mute you. Sorry.
Classic
Everyone,
Joe
please,
move.
if you're not talking, please mute your mics, guys.
Did I don't know if I answered your question sufficiently. I actually forget when I brought up delusion.
Yeah, no, you were. Yeah, no, I thought you said it was right before you were diagnosed with diabetes, and I think.
Yeah, so that must have been when I was talking about being with the girl that I met in Hawaii.
And related to this, did you ever experience like losing touch with reality when you was in the cult?
It really depends on how you
Well, like psychotic kind of break.
No, not in obvious, although there was a background effect that participating in the cult seemed to create a pseudo bipolar state in people of this kind of manic depressive swinging. But it was well within normal limits to not, require medication or anything like that. It was just very clear that there were these periods where, there would be a burst of energy that felt like a form of insight, and following it would kind of lead to a following state of a depressive cycle. And that seemed to be present in everyone in the cult. I might also add that Pavlov had a really interesting experiment with 2 different types of kind of dispositions of dog. One kind of excitable and happy, the other kind of calm. And they did this project where they would reward the dog for being able to pick out the circle compared to the ellipse. And then they slowly started distorting the circle to be more of an ellipse or an ellipsis. And they would make the ellipsis more like a circle until the dog couldn't tell which one was which. And so the punishment and the reward started appearing random to the dog. And in each of the different kind of temperaments of the dogs, the ones that were previously kind of excitable became aggressive, and would start snapping and stuff like that. Whereas as the more mild-mannered, happy dog became depressed upon interfacing with this system. And that was certainly happening within Cult 4. This kind of constant motion where you couldn't tell what behavior you were performing was going to be rewarded or punished, and how that seemed to feed into this pseudo bipolar like state that it seemed to induce in people.
So you said that was mainly online, so you weren't living there. And in what manner did this enforcement take place?
It would be through social media. So just like, calling you out on your bullshit, kind of public humiliation to some degree. Rewards were just quite simple, use the like button or whatever. Yeah. I mean, it's all reward systems that are all blatantly present on the platform, regardless of whether you're in a cult or not already. Right? You say the wrong thing in your tweet and you get lambasted by a mob of people that disagree with you. It was very similar to that. It just had its own particular filter that wasn't, whatever other cultic filter people are using on these platforms.
Well, that probably leads into Jay's question. Did you want to do that now?
Yeah.
Here, I'll read it out. So, considering the apparent ramping up of victim culture and its pseudo-academic underpinnings by critical, aka cynical theories, does critical race theory, namely D'Angelo's white fragility, map onto your cult detection criteria pattern?
Absolutely. Yeah, quite overtly. A lot of this was used within Cult 4 as well. It had a pretty leftist bend. Granted, it did something very different with it than the popular meme of the far left right now. But I might also add that my cult detection criteria, as I will probably get into next time, is much, much broader than the way that the word is commonly used. However, I would entirely say that there are many aspects of classic cult formation going on in that whole realm. Also, you see it on the right. You see it everywhere. It's once you kind of get a really clear idea of how it works, it's hard not to see it everywhere. And that might be an over detection problem. It could also be pointing towards just some fundamental quality of the nature of our sociological structures, which is where my mind has gone with it.
So,
and a lot of this seems to be in a question of degree. Like a lot of the things that you talked about, we see even elements here and elements, sort
right.
of everywhere. So yeah, these criteria, would it be more on the extreme that we have to be worried about rather than using it?
Yeah, the extreme for sure. Although I think there's also a danger in over characterizing it as existing on the extreme, in which we allow much subtler but still extraordinarily effective forms of manipulation to creep in. What I've tried to do, as I'll again get into probably next time, is try and ask, okay, some of these things are fundamental or are necessary. It seems a lot more useful to me to ask, how can this tool be used destructively or against someone or weaponized? And how can they be used positively or constructively, healthily to promote health within a sociological system.
Well, but did these people didn't consider themselves to be causing harm, right? Or do you think they did? I mean, they
Oh
had
yeah, no,
good
they had
intentions.
they had good intentions, but they also had no scruples about saying, yeah, I'm attacking your ego. Right, or like, yeah, this is probably going to hurt, or yeah, you're fucked up right now. So
Very few
again, there was
people-
no purity or goodness as a moral standard within it.
There are very few people who have bad intentions. It's just often that they have such good intentions that justifies terrible things.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think there's a
Manuel,
problem also, Nick. I'd be interested in your. Oh, sorry.
I think Manuel was trying to get in. Go
Sorry.
ahead, Manuel.
Well, I was wondering about this ability to see through people, right? And you referenced a similar thing, right? Seeing through cults.
Right.
So yeah, like you have did it disappear, or did you integrate it in some way, or like what was that about?
Yeah, so largely it felt like just the vision got cloudy, and I started re-entering a kind of deeply solipsistic take where it felt like I could see things, I could make sense of things, but there was this underlying phenomenological quality that what I was actually seeing was my own projection upon the world. Whereas this seeing very clearly state felt like I was actually interacting with the world. I was picking up signals from it, not from regurgitated signals that I was projecting onto it and then consuming again. I had spent a lot of time trying to develop that ability, and that's why, upon realizing what I considered the fruition, right, kind of the full form of that type of seeing, I found myself in a very deep type of hell. Which is not what I was expecting, having pursued such a type of vision in the many years leading up to that experience.
Nick, could you also see a type of heaven?
Yes. And I would say that when that vision was functioning properly, which is to say, when I had that experience of the thing touching, and then this clearing of the state where I could ground the energy back into the earth instead of regurgitating it out the top of my head. I definitely still had the sense of seeing very clearly, but it flowed in this very deep phenomenological sense of agapic love, that was not coming from me, but which was seemingly fully informing my action and my sense of the world. And there was a very deep, particularly after that event, this very deep sense of not even a heaven as separate from what is currently happening, but rather the heaven that was obviously and always present, even in the very, messed up world I found myself in.
Go ahead, factually.
Okay. I would pay money. I would pay money. Let's just want to say that again.
I very much appreciate that.
Extremely. No, I didn't say I will pay money. It's like I would pay money. but really, yeah.
Oh, I meant I appreciate the compliment, not the money.
Yeah, just super good. When you were going like, I'm sorry, I'm wasting time. I was like, just take time, like more, just as much detail as you can describe it in. Your comments on this. It's a really interesting notion to have developed, or even to believe you've developed this ability to see through people. Have a distillation of something which is fundamental. You might say it's fundamental to cults, but really it's just fundamentally human. It's just the cults ramp it up more. It's not, they aren't doing something alien. I think it's a mistake that people make when they do this. It's just so human to us. That's why it works.
Right.
And so seeing it, you get this ability to see through people. It's choking because it's self-referential. You realize you're doing it too.
Right.
You're actually in this. And so my question is, do you think that that's why you found it, like a lens by which you could really navigate people's motivations, or at least see the game that they were playing, or the game that we humans play, the games that entities play, conscious entities play.
Right.
And by reference yourself, it's kind of choking. The heaven that you see there is that this, like, agapic kind of notion that we're all doing this. Like, I can't blame you any more than I can blame me. Is those three worlds? So I'm talking about the lensing and the transparency, the notion by which it becomes choking, and then finally that, like, wait a minute, there could be a heaven here because I realize you're not the evil guy pulling the string. You're doing what I'm doing. We're in this. Is my analysis off there? Is that roughly how you feel it or interpret it?
So there's some interesting bits here. Usually I did not do as well a job this time, but I try and hedge my description of those experiences by saying I'm describing the phenomenological state I was in, rather than, granted, there is overt signs and responses from the people around me that lend me to the belief that there was something, or there was a sense in which I was seeing more deeply in those moments than is the standard. So yeah, it gets a little confusing, but to be on the safe side, I try and locate it as in phenomenology.
You felt like you could. Makes sense.
Right. So there's two bits there, because I was responding to the state I had before being in the cult, of this religious experience, and the state I found myself in after it. And that's where I've had this agapic love and this kind of clarity. However, within the cult, there was also this sense of a type of clarity, but the phenomenology felt really off. Right? There was no agapic love. It was more of, oh, my ego is a construct. Everyone else's egos are constructs. I can play a game inside of these constructs, and I can push on them. I can see through the game they're playing because I see through the game I'm playing by interacting with them. But there was a kind of harsh cynicism to the whole thing that was rationalized on a vision of heaven that was not available within my phenomenology at all while doing the interactions.
You were never really a true believer. You were more like you had a dissociative frame where you were sort of an anthropologist doing some of these things.
Right.
It's super interesting. Yeah, no, I'd still pay. I'd pay. Do a book or something. So much there. You said Paul Vanderklay. Did I get that right?
Yeah. He's got a YouTube channel. I think he has a playlist. I can try and find it and post it. But I've done 5 interviews with him. They're pretty wide-ranging, and I go over a lot of what I talked about here in those.
I'd be really grateful of it, just as a kind of reference. I get that you won't be doing this till the end of time. But, if you have a link to those, if you could post it, please. I'd really
I'll throw it in event text when I get a moment. We've only got about 10 minutes left, so yeah.
Thanks.
Did we have a further question? It looks like there's a few in the text.
Yeah, I think so. Jay Davids had a follow-up. Your reference to picking up signals directly, direct right relationship with the world versus regurgitated ones reminds me of Greenhall's actual thinking versus simulated thinking.
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting parallel. Yeah, I would have to remind myself of the specific ways he's talked about those two, and yet I can kind of hint at the similarity there.
And Skylar has a question, but he wants to hear your personal definition of cult first before asking. Right. So this is what I was hoping to get into in the second section here.
because I have quite a idiosyncratic definition of cult, and I had set up a whole plan of looking at popular scholarly definitions of cult, where some of the problems are and what I wanted to pose as a more useful framing. My definition of cult basically comes down to it is the meeting ground of phenomenology and sociology, or where worldviews interface with social groups. And that is a very loose definition. However, what I think it allows us to do is to move the normative boundary to the descriptor, right? So by highlighting what type of cult one is interfacing with, we can actually offer ourselves quite a bit more clarity, particularly in the cultural situation we currently find ourselves in, where everyone, the meaning crisis has everyone looking at everyone else as if they are in a cult. And so I think we need to kind of like play with this idea in a bit of a different way than we have been. But I make a much stronger argument for that in my notes, at least.
Skylar, did you want to ask your question?
Sure. I'm kind of referencing, I guess, in my head, that especially Cult 4 seemed to remind me a lot of the cult of the individual and the moral reconstitution of society, but kind of the logical limitations of that, like how you can take that argument really to an extreme. You said you kind of joined it for the expressed goal of calling out the bullshit you saw in there, yet every time the guy could kind of one up you in an argument, so at a certain point kind of feel like there's something
or one down me. He could get underneath me, right? He could always pull out the rug. And that was cool. Not a move I was familiar with.
All right. And yeah, so that's kind of, I'm very interested in linguistics and how that could play effect, because it seems like you have an idea that's kind of floating around the server. An idea is a domicile, so the lack of a home, belonging, or
right.
being well fitted together. And it seems like that group, since they were so honed in on attacking one another's positions, you figured, oh, here's where I could actually get something done, and the ground was still not able to stay solid under you. So I was kind of wondering, now that I've heard your kind of definition of the cult as kind of the meeting ground between a personal phenomenology and how the group can interact, I think I can see why the word slippage there. But yeah, I was just wondering if any of the domicide conversations have kind of clicked with you. And
oh, absolutely, yeah. I even kind of directly brought this up with Vervaeke during the Bevry conversation we had with him. And the domicide aspect I find very important, and perhaps what characterized that religious experience that I was relating to before Cult 4. More than anything was this extraordinarily deep sense of the relief of domicide, that I was in some sense home and always had been home and could never not be home. Granted, I eventually found myself not home. And I would say that the Cult 4 thing also played on this domicide aspect, in that it was in some sense very much trying to make a home in the participatory. And in some sense remind people of the home that they are in existing in the first place. Granted, they were able to make use of that and kind of bend it towards specific goals, especially given more time. As far as domicide making people extraordinarily easy to manipulate in this way, I think that's likely something that's very important as well. and perhaps also relates to what I was saying there a moment ago about how the meaning crisis has everyone viewing everyone else as being in a cult to begin with, and in some sense, it's almost like that's like a projection of the other's domicide, and how bizarrely there's almost this sense of alienation in our claiming of a group identity at all, and then we seem to have a negative individualistic response to that in the disclaiming of another's group identity. Oh, that was convoluted. Did that answer anything? Sorry.
Yeah, it really reminded me of something about the way our solutions, we kind of fixate on the solutions, and later, of course, they become our problems. So yeah, that actually
Right.
kind of helped a lot. So thank you.
Excellent.
Nick, how does it feel to have helped me start up cult number 5.x here on Discord?
Quite quite terrifying, and yet I also view it as in some deep sense inevitable.
Nick, how does it help to have like gassed me up as helping fight this cult 5.x with all the useful tools?
There we go. Perfect. The perfect dichotomy.
There you go.
Stations, everyone.
I've laid down the rugs.
Well, we're coming up to 2 hours. This has been just, I think, absolutely fascinating. And did you have anything else just on this, Nick, that you wanted to wrap up with, or did you want to bring part one to a close?
I'm trying to think. It seems like this is a good place to leave off. We went over the history. We got to explore some ideas within the context of my experience. I think it would be awkward to try and squeeze in the etymology of the word cult at this point, and would leave it off on an awkward note. So, yeah, I mean, I don't think I have much else to add here. Likewise, I feel myself unraveling a bit after having spoken so much. So I'm not sure how much longer I will be useful.
You've been absolutely amazing. I think, and I echo what was said before, that you really should write a book. It's a great story, and I'm sure what you told tonight is just the tip of the iceberg. You can just tell there's just this vast wealth of story underneath.
your insight to it. I mean, I've heard lots of stories about people from cults, but yeah, it's your take, really, your insight. It's like, yeah,
Bravo.
this was amazing. Thank you.
I appreciate the appreciation.
So
It is.
yeah, well, yeah, no, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it's always nice when these bits of our stories, particularly the more destructive or experimental aspects, are able to be contextualized to and for others as useful. So
some good.
Well,
yeah.
I mean, your experience is directly relevant to what we're trying to do here, and I think we're all cognizant of the risk. I've even had people tell me, when I tell them what we're up to, saying, "Well, how do you not become a cult?" And so, you know, it's definitely pretty high on my mind to not become a cult. So yeah, this is very relevant.
Yeah, we don't want to become a cult. We want to become a religion.
That's not, we don't want to become a cult. We want to become the cult, right?
There you go.
Right. All hail.
All right. Well,
That's a good place
thank you
to
so
end.
much.
Excellent.
Thank you so much, Nick. Thank you,
Yes.
everyone, for being here. We had a great crowd tonight. Thank you, Manuel, for helping out with the recording. I'm going to really try to see what Discord did to screw up all my settings. And this has been just great. And we'll talk, Nick, and schedule part 2. So thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Nick.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you all for listening and the interesting questions as well. Appreciate it.
It was great. Thank you.
Yeah. When is part 2?
We'll schedule that and we'll put it up on the calendar and we'll announce it.
Excellent.